you for being with us here this evening. We are really excited to talk about solar for nonprofits. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to get started. Sorry, one moment. All right. So sorry, folks. My computer's running a little slowly, of course, at the moment. So hopefully that picks up. Okay. All right. Panelists, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen okay? All right, looks great. All right, folks, thank you for your patience tonight. As I said, my name is Sarah Solomon. I am the Director of Community Impact here at Solar United Neighbors. We are so excited to bring tonight's webinar to you. So let's dive in. All right, so first order of business. If you are here and you need to hear the webinar in Spanish, you will go ahead and click interpretation at the bottom of your screen, and then you'll select English or Spanish for your language preferences. If you on your smartphone, you'll click more and then language interpretation, and then you'll select either English or Spanish. All right, and folks, this is a webinar, but we welcome your questions. So the best way to get your question answered is to put your question in the Q&A box, which is this box on the right. This box on the left will allow you to chat with other webinar attendees. However, sometimes questions can get lost in that chat. So, if you want the best chance of your question being answered, please do put that in the Q&A section. And then for our panelists this evening, we have Emma Searson. She is a policy and advocacy campaigner here at Solar United Neighbors. We have Corey Ramsden, our VP of Go Solar Programs at Solar United Neighbors. And we're really excited to have Jim Philbin here with us. He is the Senior Director of One Roof Community Housing. All right, I guess without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Corey.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you're coming from. We've got some information that we're going to share first just to kind of get everybody on the same page about who we are and what we're doing here. But just to let folks know who are not as familiar with our organization, we are a vendor-neutral nonprofit, and that is a lot of the work that we do is really helping people go solar, join together, and fight for their energy rights, including educational work like what we're doing this evening. Next slide. So this work really is about helping people go solar, ideally, which is supporting them through our co-op programming or some of the other things we do like help desk, and providing people the resources they need, helping people join together with others in their communities, and then ultimately, hopefully making changes, advocacy work to improve the conditions for renewable adoptions all over the country. And that is what we do all over the United States. Next slide. Just a little bit about our impact. I won't go over the numbers here, but we've been doing this work for over a decade now and all over the place, and just gratified that we're able to help so many people go solar and really provide those resources. And this is another example of that this evening. Next slide. Before we get into the presentation a little bit, though, I just want to take a moment to address the inequities in our current energy system. Low-income and communities of color in particular have the highest energy burdens. On average, low-income households spend about 7.2% of their income on utilities, while higher-income families spend only about 2.3%. Communities of color, particularly Black and brown communities, bear an unfair share of the costs of the energy production in our electricity system. And rooftop solar really lets communities invest locally. It creates good local jobs. It brings control of the energy system within our reach, and we're working towards that energy system that everyone can participate in, one that's fair and equitable and really has rooftop solar as the cornerstone, and that's really important to the work that we do. Next slide. I'm not going to get too much into the history here. A lot of you probably have seen this before, but as I said, we've been around for about a decade, and our work has grown quite a bit over the years, from being based in Washington, D.C., all the way up to 50 states now, and Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico, where we do this work pretty actively in those locations. Next slide. So some things we're going to cover this evening. I'm going to do just a quick Solar 101 for you here. We'll talk a little bit about financing and the federal tax credit. Then I'm going to turn it over to Emma to talk about direct pay and a little bit about selecting your installer. Then we're going to hear from Jim to share some of his experiences with his organization, One Roof Community Housing. Next slide. Excuse me. So a little bit about steps for just to kind of orient you about going solar as a nonprofit, or if you're somebody who's helping a nonprofit go solar. And the first thing is really just taking the time to learn about putting solar on a property. Part of that you're doing this evening. Really important to identify who the decision makers are within an organization, because that is a key component to the decision process, is really just making sure that you can figure out who is the yes that you need, or the group that is supposed to provide that yes. And then getting buy-in to actually do some investigation. So you want to just make sure that folks are on board with you going through and finding proposals, for example, for your faith community or for an organization that you work with. Really important to identify whether the nonprofit owns that property, because they do need to have control over it to be able to put solar on the property. Potentially getting approval from a landlord is also okay, but really owning that property is important. Getting those proposals, running through a decision-making process with whoever those stakeholders are, and then ultimately starting that process and moving forward. So just kind of a quick snapshot, but as decision makers, identifying them and just making sure the property is suitable for solar are two really important steps. Next slide. So what we're talking about here is solar photovoltaics. I'm sure a number of you probably come to these presentations before, so we won't dwell on this too much, but we're talking about converting electricity from sunlight. I'm sorry, converting the sunlight into electricity for a property to use, as opposed to solar hot water, for example. Next slide. So that means taking photovoltaic cells, usually framed modules that are on a roof, being able to convert those into alternating current from the direct current that comes from those modules that goes through an inverter, which we'll talk about in a second, and ultimately powers your property with clean energy from your roof, or for some or all of your electricity needs, depending on the size of the array and how much energy you're using. Next slide. One of the pieces here that you'll work through is racking, so how to connect it to the property. You can also do solar on the ground, as you see in that bottom left picture. And there are lots of different ways, and the important piece here is lots of different ways to connect solar to your property. And installers are going to have that skill, that knowledge to be able to know what is the best and most appropriate one for you. And there's a couple different versions. Asphalt shingle roofs, pretty straightforward. If you're working on a flat roof, there's lots of options there. Really important to understand the condition of that roof and the structures of it. And installers will be able to help you with that. And then on the ground, as I said, is also perfectly acceptable as long as it's suitable for ground installation in your area for zoning, which sometimes can be an issue depending on whether you're in an urban area or not. And these are all things your installer can walk you through. Our help desk also is a great place to go if you have questions about this, and we'll post some information about that in the chat. Already there, excellent. Next slide. A little bit about components. I mentioned this earlier, but the inverters, that's really the brain of the array, and that's going to take that DC electricity from your panels and convert it to AC, or alternating current, for the electricity that actually powers your property. And there are lots of different options here. Installers can walk you through what's appropriate for you. Important to remember that for commercial properties, you probably are going to have, but not always, three-phase power, and you're going to need equipment that can support that. So identifying what that electricity service is on your property is an important early step when you're working with installers. Next slide. Just another example here of optimizers, or what they call panel level optimization, and that's for units that go for each panel to make sure that they produce the maximum amount of electricity they can. And this is just another option that gets used for roofs that might have lots of different shading issues that happen over the course of the day or the year. Next slide. Microinverters, another example of that, just trying to find solutions for properties to make sure that those systems can produce as much as possible. They also are connected to each individual module, and they also allow you to report on energy production on a module basis. So these both optimizers and microinverters are pretty common for smaller arrays in particular, small commercial and residential. Next slide. Some things to keep in mind as you're looking at your your offers and proposals. One, really important to check with your insurance company early on to make sure that you understand if there are any costs associated with your policy going up to support solar on your property. This can vary quite a bit. Ideally, there shouldn't be any change, but you do want to identify that. In some places, there isn't even a chance, like in places like Florida, where there's some challenge with insurance, where your insurance company might actually have an issue with that. That's generally not the case, but there are some places where that can be a factor. So you do just want to make sure that you are checking ahead. If you run into problems or you have questions about that and answers you're getting from your insurance company, feel free to reach out to us. And you just want to identify that early in the process. Other warranties are things that are in play here. You've got several warranties on your system that are available. Product, power production are both related to your panels, and those are with the manufacturer. And we're happy to explain a little bit more of that later on if folks have questions. And then installation, which is the workmanship warranty, that's from the installer themselves. And that's on the work they do to assemble all the parts and put it into your, attach it to your roof or connect it to your property. That also includes things like the penetrations they make in your roof. Next slide. Other things to keep in mind: one, monitoring is available, and you'll have access to be able to see how much energy your system is producing. Two, in areas that maybe have or drier, that have some more dust and that kind of thing, you want to consider washing your panels, once a year or once every other year. Places where there's more rain, that's not necessarily as likely, especially for panels that are installed on a pitched roof, because the rain tends to wash that off. Also, solar is low maintenance, but it's not no maintenance. You do want to check on it periodically. We recommend folks get inspections 3 to 5 years just to make sure that things look okay. No panels are damaged by squirrels chewing on wires, for example. And then just making sure that you have a good sense of that, and getting checkups periodically is a good idea to make sure your investment is in good working order. Next slide. Talking a little bit about financing, and we can come back to this at the end during Q&A if folks have more questions. But direct ownership is really if you're paying cash or through loans. Lots of loan options out there, and those are usually available from a variety of sources, credit unions, things of that nature, as well as solar loan providers. And there are more and more options available for nonprofits as well. And then third-party ownership is where you don't own the system, someone else does, and it's you're essentially giving space on your roof. You get the electricity savings, but they own and operate the system. So you also don't get the tax credit or any of the incentives because you're not the system owner. So that's another common arrangement that is also available to nonprofits in some places, depending on state law. Next slide. Important incentive, biggest one out there that is available to everyone in the US in terms of geography, and that's the federal tax credit at a nice 30% for commercial projects as well, all the way through 2033, and then starts to step down. And this is something that through direct pay, which we'll talk about tonight, nonprofits can also access this tax credit, even if they do not have federal tax liability. Next slide. Taking that tax credit, some important things to consider. One, and we hear this a lot, is that replacing your roof. So, for example, getting your shingles replaced is not going to be covered by the tax credit, according to the IRS. Some things might be like reinforcing the structure of your roof, but roof replacements in general are not. Other things related to the equipment are. And keep in mind, who gets those incentives is the system owner. So if you're paying in cash or financing and you own that system, you're keeping that incentive and you can claim it. If a third party owns the system, such as with a lease or a power purchase agreement, then they own that system, and then they can take the tax credit. Next slide. There are what they call adders that are, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, that are available. And these are things that you can apply for under certain conditions to take an additional bump on your tax credit. So that 30%, which is the standard, can be increased. Something called energy communities, and these are certain geographic areas of the United States. There's some great maps out there. You'll see them on our site, on our direct pay page, linked, as well as other locations. And if you're in one of those communities geographically, you can then actually take an additional 10% for a commercial solar project. And nonprofit solar is technically under the commercial tax code. So if you're in one of those communities, you're now at 40%. Domestic content is under certain quantities of equipment that are produced in the United States or meet certain qualifications, you can also take an additional 10%. Now, this one is a little harder right now because the information that's available on what equipment qualifies is not particularly good or available, which means that it's defined, but it's not super clear on the commercial side whether this is a usable credit at the moment. But we expect that will change over time as manufacturers are able to identify which components, which pieces, which products installers can buy that will satisfy this requirement. Next slide. There are also some application-based credits, and these are very competitive. They just finished the first round this year and had lots and lots of applications for what is capped at 1.8 gigawatts of installed capacity a year. And these are for certain projects that are either located in a low and moderate income community or are actually on a building or benefit directly participants who are in that category. And if you were selected for those credits, you can either have a 10% additional adder, and that's for the community-based one, or a 20% adder for building-based or direct benefit to participants. So these are all things that even make that tax credit even greater. But remember, again, these are application-based, so there is definitely a chance that you may not get that. So just planning purposes, it's really important to know that these particular ones you have to get selected instead of versus the energy tax credit. I'm sorry, the energy communities and the domestic content, which are open to anybody as long as you meet the qualifications. Next slide. Equipment that's eligible for the ITC, as I mentioned earlier, all the panels, inverters, racking, et cetera, installation costs are eligible. If you go to the next slide, there's some other things as well. And these are important for commercial projects because these definitely can come into play, which are transformer upgrades, for example, that you might need for your property, circuit breakers and surge arresters and things that are potentially needed. Energy storage is also covered if it's over 3 kilowatt hours, which is just about every option on the market, and potentially interconnection costs. So that's the cost the utility might say that they need to charge you to connect your system to the grid. And those are also potentially eligible for the tax credit. Next slide. So here, I'm going to turn it over. I know I kind of went a little quickly there. We'll definitely have time for questions. So I wanted to make sure that we got through that part to get everything set and ready to go for our next presenter, which is Emma. And she's going to cover some details about direct pay and some of the related issues around how big your tax credit might be if you're getting grant funding. So I'm going to turn it over to Emma.
Great. Thank you so much, Corey, for that jam-packed and very helpful overview. For anyone who might have joined us just a couple minutes after we got started, again, my name is Emma Searson. I am a policy and advocacy campaigner with Solar United Neighbors. And now that you are all at least a little bit familiar with the process of going solar and the technology that's involved, we can go ahead and dive into what actually makes those federal tax incentives that Corey touched on accessible to nonprofit organizations, and that is elective or direct pay. So elective pay is the official IRS name for this program, but I think you'll more often hear folks refer to it as direct pay. So that's the terminology I'm going to use. This program was first passed into law in 2022 as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, and it was implemented in 2023 by the IRS. So what it does is just enable entities that are exempt from paying federal income taxes to still receive a direct payment, essentially a cash rebate, in lieu of the federal solar tax credit that for-profit entities are able to benefit from. So it is a really exciting and impactful program because it's expanding access to that really useful tax benefit to a whole host of groups and organizations that weren't previously able to use that tax credit and bring down the cost of going solar. So there are a few different types of tax-exempt entities that are eligible for direct pay. Those include 501A, C, and D nonprofit organizations, state and local governments, tribal governments, U.S. territories, rural electric cooperatives, and a few others as well. And thanks to direct pay, some of those organizations and governments that previously might not be able to consider going solar because it's expensive upfront might actually be able to make that investment now and reap the benefits for years to come. So one small note that we'll get into on the next slide too is that even though these entities don't necessarily have to file federal tax returns every year, they will need to file tax forms in order to claim direct pay. So on the next slide, we can go ahead and talk about the process. Like, how do you actually claim direct pay? So the first thing that the tax-exempt entity involved is going to need to do to actually start their solar project. So thinking back to Corey's overview, this is a kind of broad first step. It can include everything from actually making the decision to go solar and getting proposals from a few different companies to maybe even signing a contract with the chosen installer. There's another thing that you'll want to take care of pretty much as early as possible, and that is getting either a federal employer identification number, or EIN, or a taxpayer identification number, or TIN. You'll need one or the other in order to actually file when the time comes. And if you do it by mail, it can take a few weeks. So in my opinion, it's best just to knock that out right away. Then once you've done those two things, you will need to decide which tax year you'll be able to complete your project in. And that will help you determine which tax year you'll get the rebate for, the direct pay. Once you know that, you can go ahead and complete your project. And one important thing to note here is that the official date that the project is deemed complete is the date that you place it in service, or in other words, the date that you can actually interconnect it to the electric grid and it can start producing power for you. So once your project is complete and it's placed in service, you can actually get a registration ID from the IRS by using their online pre-registration system. So this is something you do before you file taxes. The IRS recommends actually doing this pretty early. They prefer 120 days or more before you plan to file taxes for the given year. So keep that in mind when you're planning out your project and making sure it's complete well ahead of when your taxes will be due. Once you have that registration ID from the IRS, then you can go ahead and file your tax return by whatever due date applies, given the tax return type. For most organizations, that due date is going to be May 15th of the following year. So that's May 15th, 2024 for the 2023 tax year, and so on. In your filing, you will include the registration ID that you got through the pre-filing registration system for each tax credit that you're claiming for direct pay. So you get an ID for each one. And the specific forms you'll need to complete vary. They depend on where you're based and the type of the organization. Generally speaking, the first thing will be whatever annual tax form your organization usually files, or Form 990T if you don't usually file one. And then 2, whatever specific tax credit forms or worksheets are required for the credit or credits that you're applying for. So finally, after all those steps are complete, then the IRS will actually disperse a cash payment or a refund for the amount that you've claimed, and that's the direct pay. So let's move on to the next slide and actually look at the financials for a couple of example nonprofit solar projects so that you can get a sense of how direct pay actually fits into the equation. So in this first example, we are looking at a 25 kilowatt solar array, and it's going to cost $70,000 total. And that total is including the equipment itself, as well as any other eligible project costs, like the labor that it took to install the system, as Corey mentioned. So just for simplicity's sake here, let's say that this particular project is not going to be eligible for any additional adder credits. So we're just looking at that base federal tax credit of 30%. That means that the value of the tax credit for this project will come out to $21,000. That's the maximum rebate amount that an organization would be able to receive via direct pay after, of course, building the project and submitting that tax filing. There could be some additional incentives to take into account here, depending on where the project is. So some states offer additional state level rebates or have SREC programs that can help bring down the net cost even further. But even without any additional incentives beyond direct pay, you can see that the net investment for this project is already coming way down just with the tax credit to $49,000. Let's go to the next slide. I want to point out that many tax-exempt organizations rely on grant funding for significant portions of their budget. So understanding how direct pay interacts with grants is going to be very important to understanding the finances of a project. So the important caveat here is that the IRS rules that apply are not final. They could still change. But according to the provisional or draft language that you are seeing here on the slide, any tax-exempt grants or forgivable loans that are used to pay for a solar project can be included in calculating the basis for that project, but the combination of the grant or the loan plus the investment tax credit value cannot be greater than the installed system cost. So don't worry, I know that was a lot of jargon. On the next slide, we're going to look at another example to actually make sense of what that means. So we have another example nonprofit solar project here. This time, the total cost is $100,000, big round numbers for easy math. Let's say this organization received an $80,000 grant to help pay for the project. So the first table here is what not to do. This shows what would happen if the basis for the tax credit had to be reduced by the grant amount. So if that were the case, the basis would only be the portion of the project costs not covered by the grant, or $20,000 in this case. And therefore, the value of the tax credit would be 30% of that, or just $6,000. Thankfully, that is not how the basis calculation works. So the basis for the purpose of claiming direct pay is still equal to the total cost of the project, the full $100,000, as you see in the second table, even though a grant is being used to pay for a big chunk of it. So the maximum value of the tax credit is 30% of that full $100,000, and therefore would be up to $30,000. So I'm noting up to, you're probably hearing that. Let's go to the next slide. I want to remind you that the combination of the grant or the loan plus the tax credit value cannot be greater than the total installed system cost. So let's look at what would happen if this organization that's building their $100,000 solar project actually received a grant for the full cost of the project to really see how this plays out. So the basis will still be the full system cost, $100,000. So the maximum value of the tax credit will still be $30,000. But here's where that rule comes into play. You can see that the combination of the grant plus the tax credit value adds up to $130,000, which is, of course, $30,000 more than the system cost. And since those two things, the grant or the loan and the tax credit, cannot exceed the costs, that means that this organization isn't going to be able to take advantage of the tax credit. The amount that they'll actually be eligible to receive drops all the way down to $0. So what that means is that while grants and loans don't reduce basis, they can reduce the size of the rebate that an organization is actually eligible to receive at the end of the day. And that happens if the grant or the loan plus the value of the tax credit exceed the total cost of the project. So if this organization wanted to make sure that they maximize the tax credit, that they take full advantage of that savings opportunity, they might want to pursue a grant of just $70,000 instead of $100,000, because then the grant plus the 30% tax credit together would add up to exactly the total project costs. Okay, so we have been deep in the numbers. Let's go to the next slide. Numbers are, of course, a very important factor in determining the financials of your project and how to move forward. But there are lots of other important attributes that you might want to consider when you're shopping around for solar installers beyond just the price they can offer. It can be really helpful to look at online reviews to give you some sort of feel for the kind of experiences that folks are having with each installer. Similarly, referrals from community members or nearby communities or maybe nonprofits in your community can also be helpful. You might also want to know if an installer that you're considering has experience with commercial projects, which most nonprofit projects are, or even with nonprofit projects in particular, because that will give them some added experience with this whole direct pay process, and they'll be better able to kind of hold your hand through it. It's also important to know if an installer can meet your specific equipment needs and preferences. You know, if you have a specific brand of solar panel that you want to make sure you get, or if you need a certain type of racking in order to accommodate your roof, you'll want to know upfront if the installer can provide those things. Then installer workmanship warranties and certifications like NABCEP can also be really good indicators of quality and can help make sure that you pick an installer that is not only affordable, but also knowledgeable and skilled and is going to do good, reliable work. So that is all I'm going to cover for now. I know you all have questions. I'm excited to get to those in a bit, but I actually want to pass the proverbial microphone off to our next speaker, Jim, so that we can all hear a little bit about his story of actually using direct pay.
All right. Hello, everybody. I was looking through the chat to see where people are from. I didn't see any Minnesotans out there, but we do get sun in Minnesota. So just so you know, we're eligible up here as well. I am the Community Land Trust Program Director at OneRoof. So if you want to go to the next slide, I think there's a little summary of what a community land trust is. Hopefully some of you know what a community land trust is, but we are a nonprofit. There's community land trusts all over the country where they can be used for many purposes, but the most common one is affordable home ownership for low-income households. So that's how we're set up. So we serve folks who earn under 80% of area median income. That's the clients that we serve, and we help them purchase homes. And where the name comes from is that the households, they purchase the home and then they lease the land. So OneRoof Community Housing maintains ownership of the land under the homes, but the houses are owned by the individuals, by the families. So maybe if you want to go on to the next slide. And this is who we serve, just to give you an idea of the clients that we're working with, right? These are low, moderate income, as they're called. We serve on average folks about 80 or 60% of AMI in our Duluth market. That's, you know, these numbers are from the last 3 years combined, like 2021 through 2023. So the homes that we're selling on average, we're worth 180. We're selling for 128, just to give you some idea. And I realize your numbers around the country are going to be wildly different probably. But the idea of the program is to create affordable homeownership for folks who would be excluded from traditional market rate housing. And once a home comes into the land trust, then it remains in the trust forever. The home has to be owner occupied. And whenever the current homeowner chooses to sell, then the home gets resold through the land trust program to another income eligible household. And the reason why I'm giving you that context is because what that means is that OneRoof, we are very invested in the houses because they remain forever in our land trust portfolio. So it's not a situation where we just help somebody buy a house and then we step out of the deal and that's it. We have a long-term relationship with all of our homeowners. We have we call it a stewardship, post-purchase stewardship, so that we want them to be successful as homeowners. And so we're always looking at creative avenues for how to help them be successful as homeowners. So if you want to go to the next slide. So we have, we're one of the largest in the nation, and we have 331 homes. They're single family detached homes. They kind of came into our portfolio over the last 20 years or so through these three different ways. Some homes that we newly built, some that we acquired and renovated, and some that we provided a down payment and closing cost and rehab assistance, and folks went out and picked homes on the market. And significantly, of those 331 homes, 218 of them have resold, but through the land trust program. And so it's a shout out for anybody who's out there that works in affordable housing. This is a great model. So we've been able to help 549 households purchase affordable homes, even though we only have 331 homes in our portfolio, because of our resales and the resale formula that keeps the homes affordable. So that's kind of just the overview of what we bring to the table. So if you want to go to the next one, so we were approached in 2020 by Sun, and they recognized that because we worked with a low income population through our community land trust program, and would we be interested in exploring the possibility of getting solar on some of the homes that our homeowners own? And we said, yeah, absolutely. Because the utility costs, of course, like anywhere, are a significant part of a homeowner's expenses and affect their affordability over time. So this kind of lists the arrays that have been installed, and one of the things I don't get paid by Sun, I don't make any money off of this, but I'll just say they've been really great to work with and have delivered. Sometimes we've been approached from a million people to do a million different things that never quite materialize as a nonprofit. But we actually let's make this happen. So we've had 17 of our homeowners in the last 3 years get solar arrays on their homes, which is really fabulous to see it happen. And there's a lot of excitement among our land trust homeowner community for this to happen. Many of them have been trying to do this, but it just wasn't affordable. It wasn't feasible or possible in the prior years. And so when this opportunity came up, we went all in on it. Brooke, who is our stewardship coordinator for our land trust homeowners, is the one that was most directly involved. She's at another event tonight, so I'm pitching in. But I won't go into the details of all these because that's not what I'm good at. But what's really key for us, what we recognize is, okay, we have the relationships with the homeowners and the connection and the trust and the communication and the need, right? And we bring that to the table. And then Sun has the expertise on the solar knowledge, and then helped us partner with different local installers to do the solar panels. And that whole first half hour, I understood about 10% of it. So that's like, I don't need to know that, right? They know that. So that's that they bring to the table. It's been super, super helpful. So that's been our experience. We've had some that have come in through direct grants. We got partnership with our local utility company. Once they see this other money, they want to get in on it. There's a Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. Like, you're able to leverage other resources once you have a partner that knows what they're doing and is able to take the lead and make those connections. I'll just close by saying, anybody that is curious of a follow-up post-webinar, very happy to talk via email or phone, and especially with Brooke, who's been real directly involved with our homeowners, to talk about that experience of what it was like for them. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. That was so helpful. And I'm sure many folks will be wanting to reach out to you. And I guess next, I'm just going to pass it back to Corey, who's going to share a little bit about our Ready Set Solar for Nonprofits program.
Thanks, Sarah. So these are one of the things that we try to do is provide different ways for folks to get assistance. And one thing that we've done recently, in a couple different flavors, so to speak, is something we call Ready Set Solar. And this is really sort of self-guided work, where it is a timed email series. It's 7 emails for the first week, and then 1 a week for another 7 weeks, to get people from learning anything they need to about solar, that first 30 minutes tonight, to what do I need to do to get proposals? How does direct pay work in this case? and just kind of checking in and providing that resource. Our help desk provides the backup. If you need to, you can reply and we'll try to help you however we're able, and that's a free service. So Ready Set Solar is, you can think of, we also call it internally like 8 weeks to solar ready. It's a way to get you activated and to follow along in a sort of a path to take an organization solar. Is it going to answer 100% of your questions? Probably not, but at least it sort of leads you along, and that is called Ready Set Solar. That's available to anybody in the country, and you can see the link there. Feel free to sign up for that if you are interested in learning more about taking your nonprofit solar. Next slide. You've heard us mention this a couple times this evening, but we do have a solar help desk that is nationally available and free. You can reach us at both of those locations there listed, and I think they'll also be in the chat. And this is our team here that we were very fortunate to be able to scale that team up in the last 9 months or so. And our team there will do their best to assist you. We also can kick questions up to like level 2, level 3 support. Some of those end up on my desk to really try to do our best to assist people and make sure that they have the resources they need if they're trying to take their organization or their home or whatever the case may be, solar. Next slide. Sarah, did you want to cover this one?
Yeah, I am definitely happy to. Thanks, Corey. And then hopefully we'll have a few moments left to cover some of these questions. I saw so many great questions in the chat, or sorry, in the Q&A. But we welcome folks to join us here at Solar United Neighbors and spread the word about solar in your community, and help folks and nonprofits around around your community learn about these resources that we have available. So if you use that short link that's on the screen there, bit.ly/Sun Volunteer, you can learn about all the ways that you can volunteer here at Sun. But I'll just go ahead and say, we are a nonprofit. We do rely on members of the community spreading the word and sharing their story and advocating for solar-friendly policies to, their elected officials. And so it really is a meaningful way to spend your time. And especially if you've had a positive experience with solar and you have, recognized the benefits of solar, what a better way to kind of give back to the growing solar movement than to volunteer with Sun. All right, so I kind of blew through that slide, but yeah, I guess we can go ahead and open it up for questions. I saw several in the chat. I don't want to put Emma or Corey in the spotlight, but were there any in particular either of you wanted to answer live?
I think we can go through a couple here. I've tried to answer a number of them typing, so hopefully that got to a fair number of questions. There's one at the top here from Ron Leonard about making sure people know that the direct pay ended abruptly, and that was something we should share with people. I'm not super clear on what you're referring to, Ron, but it is important for us to just make sure, and I didn't do this at the beginning, which is direct pay is a new program. No one has applied for it successfully yet because 2023 is the first tax year that it was available. So people are getting ready to do this now, organizations that completed their projects in 2023. And the rules are still what they call proposed regulations. They're pretty detailed. They're likely to stay very similar to what we've explained, but the IRS still has to finalize those. The application process to get that registration ID that Emma mentioned is open, and it has a really detailed guide that the IRS released. So it's just important for people to understand, like, this is new. The Inflation Reduction Act made this possible, and there's going to be some things we all learn along the way. So I just wanted to sort of make that clear because we didn't state that up front. And that's frankly one of the reasons why we're doing these and following along closely with nonprofits that need our help so that we can learn and hopefully reflect that into improvements as well as sharing it with others. Emma, did you see any there that you wanted to address directly? We can go back and forth, or I can just keep going.
Yeah, that sounds good. Let's go back and forth. I mean, I'm going to leave the 1 megawatt one to you because I think you can get in the weeds on that one a little bit better. But I did see one on REAP grants, which so happens to be a thing that I spend a lot of my time working on. So I can touch on that one really quickly. For folks who haven't heard of REAP, which stands for the Rural Energy for America program, this is a grant program that helps for-profit farms and rural small businesses go solar by providing direct federal grants to do that. And in answer to your question, Jeremy, most of the time you cannot do a REAP grant and direct pay, not because there's a rule against the two, but because they're for two different groups. Direct pay benefits tax-exempt organizations or nonprofits, governments, whereas REAP grants, for the most part, are only for for-profit farms and rural small businesses. So usually there's not a lot of overlap there.
Thanks. We're fortunate to have Emma on tonight for that because, as she mentioned, she spends a lot of time learning and telling people about and advocating for REAP policies. So that is a nice juxtaposition there. I'm going to take this question here about how are the rules and registration process different for systems over 1 megawatt? You saw a reference in one of those slides about that. There are, in the Inflation Reduction Act for projects over 1 megawatt, there are some requirements with respect to labor standards that are important to follow in order for you to qualify for higher levels of the tax credit and the adders. For the sake of like setting expectations on size for nonprofit projects, small commercial projects, most of them, and again, there's a wide range based on the size of the property and your energy usage, but most of them are going to be in the like 20 to 500 kilowatt range, which is not near that 1 megawatt limit. So we expect that a lot of the small commercial and nonprofit projects, they're going to be below that. So they're going to get the maximum amount that is available for the ones that they qualify for. So we didn't really point that out in that slide, but that's a great question for us to answer there. Emma, your turn.
Great. Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button after all these years. There are a couple of questions I've seen kind of around the theme of, hold on, we don't pay taxes. Nonprofits, churches don't pay taxes. So how are we benefiting from this tax credit? So just to clarify that, direct pay or elective pay, that term Corey and I keep using, is a new program that gets around that hurdle. And what it does is provide a cash payment or a rebate from the federal government instead of a discount or credit off of taxes. So even though these nonprofit organizations and churches don't pay taxes, they'll be able to get the same value of the tax credit, 30% most of the time, through a direct cash payment from the federal government by using this application process that Corey was just talking about.
Thanks, Emma. Really important to note that. I'm going to take two here just because they're right next to each other. A question about different types of nonprofit organizations. If you go to the elective pay page that we've linked to here, there's a little bit more detail there, but really important that there are probably some types of not-for-profit organizations that can't take direct pay because of the part of the tax code that they're in. So generally speaking, I think it's 501A, that group, which includes 501c3 organizations, are going to be able to take it. But depending on how the organization was formed, homeowners associations, condo associations, for example, may not be eligible. So that's a really important step to identify, which is how is your organization formed, and then checking the rules for direct pay to see whether they're in that category. And if you're not sure how to navigate that, and you know what type of organization you have, but you're just not sure where to look it up, let us know. We'll do our best to point you in the right direction. This next one here, which is asking about a church that uses the national organization's TIN, the tax identification number. I'm going to give you, I think, what I think is the answer, but it's really important to just check the rules from the IRS direct pay guide, because each identification number you can only apply for registration IDs for your installation or installations once a year. So if you've got a single ID number that you're using to request those registration IDs, and more than one church within that national organization also wants to do that, you might create some issues there. So that's really important to narrow down first. And if I can point you to where that information is if you contact our help desk and just mention that I talked about this on the webinar, I can help you track that down. But that's a really great question that needs to be sorted out before you think about applying for those registration IDs.
Yeah, I'm really glad you touched on that, Corey. On a similar note, this question isn't next in the list, but I was scrolling through and think it's an important one. Someone wants to know if Solar United Neighbors only works with nonprofits. The answer is no. We targeted this webinar specifically around nonprofits. We get a lot of questions from nonprofits and churches and these tax-exempt organizations now that this new program is out there, but we help all sorts of individuals, businesses, nonprofits, you name it, go solar. You're welcome to take advantage of the resources we provide on our website, as well as the help desk that Sarah helpfully just put in the chat, regardless of whether or not you are with a nonprofit. Thanks for asking.
I see a couple of questions here about grants and the kind of the definitions of them for what Emma talked about with respect to the how much of the tax credit you can take. Usual caveats apply. We're not tax advisors. You do want to have a conversation with your tax professional and make sure you understand what the implications are based on the rules that have been written. The rules about the grant are one of these areas that, frankly, is a little challenging for an organization that's getting grant funding for solar, but they're specifically talking about grants that have been given for the purpose of installing solar. I don't believe that there was a lot of guidance, if any, about the source of the grant, which was one of those questions, whether it was a private gift or, say, from a foundation. But you should definitely verify that with your tax provider. That's not something we can answer definitively, unfortunately.
Yes, a little bit of a theme here that Corey and I are unfortunately not tax advisors. I've seen a couple of questions on like the different types of adders, like the energy and domestic content adder, the environmental community, or for blanking on the word, but the community-based adders and the low-income-based adders, and whether or not we have some additional information on those. We do on our website. I'll find the link and put it in the chat in just a little bit. It's kind of high-level basic information on what the different adders are and who applies to them. And you can also find way, way more detailed information on all of those adders on the IRS's website. They have frequently asked questions that really get into the specifics of who's eligible for what and how it works. And just related to that, I think this is from a little while ago, but there was also a question about how to actually, like, let's say you do qualify for one of those adders, how to actually go about getting direct pay for that additional 10% or whatever it may be. And the process, as far as we know at this point, is the same as it is for the general 30% tax credit. All those steps that I went through of completing your project, using pre-registration, using that pre-registration ID number to then actually fill out the tax forms at the end of the year, those steps are all the same. You just have to make sure that for any additional credits you're claiming, you have a unique registration ID number.
There's a question in here that to see about the timing, to just kind of to go over the timing again for application. There was a point in that sequence that Emma was talking about with respect to having the system placed in service is the language, and that is a precondition, interconnection to the grid or the system being completed, but has to be done before you apply, because you'll need to provide that during that application to get the registration ID. So in terms of sequence, it's, the system is completed, you can prove that it's done and that is, approved for operation. And when you apply for the registration ID, you'll need to provide that information, and then you'll need the registration ID to put it into your applicable tax forms when you claim direct pay. And again, that point that I mentioned earlier, if you are somebody who's installing multiple systems, so say, for example, the land trust, when Jim was talking, if they install 4 systems or 10 systems and they're taking direct pay for all of them, they'll need registration IDs for all of those systems, but they can only apply once per taxpayer ID per year, according to the guide. So you have to make sure you got everything all lined up, everything's done, you've got all your documentation, and then you apply for the registration IDs. So there's some sequencing there that's really important.
Yep. I think we must have a lot of folks who are here with houses of worship and churches tonight, which is very exciting. I see one question basically asking if your church or house of worship doesn't normally file any sort of income tax form, whether that's a 990 or something else, do you need to file one for the year that you're claiming direct pay? Generally, the answer is yes, you're going to have to file something. It might not necessarily be a 990 depending on the organization and where you are. I think that's the most common answer, which is why I mentioned it in my slides, that the 990T is probably what you'll need, but that's a perfect question for a tax advisor as well.
Thanks, Emma. Let's see, there's a couple other ones I think that we're just looking for some other themes here.
I have one that kind of came to mind while you're scrolling, Corey, that I can touch on.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Which is how far in the future a solar project can occur. This one is important, I think, because I just want to reiterate that I might be misreading the question. Like you might just mean like how long is direct pay going to exist or something like that. But which of course I'm no crystal ball reader, but you can't actually file for and claim direct pay until the project's complete. So you actually have to have already gone through all the steps, and be all the way at the end of the process. I know sometimes it can take a really long time to shop around and do all the planning and go through the installation, but you do have to do all of that before you can actually file for direct pay and get that benefit. So just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Thanks, Emma. Sarah, as we're going through these, do you see any that you want to make sure that you address that are more related to the organization? I want to make sure we're not taking up all the time if you have things that you spotted as well.
I appreciate that. No, I think you all covered it really well. I did kind of just want to close this off with a few reminders. I know everyone here shared a lot of great information, but I think, main takeaways are if you are a nonprofit or a nonprofit who is interested in going solar, Sun did develop a free program we developed a free program that will simplify the process of installing solar and provide step-by-step guidance, and that is called our Ready Set Solar for Nonprofits program. And so I just put the link to that in the chat. If anyone is interested, please do check that out. It's pretty comprehensive and will give you a lot of good, at least first steps. And then if you do end up having additional questions, as Corey said, we do have our free solar help desk, which you can always check out as well. And I'm gonna grab that link for you and pop that in the chat. And then lastly, I will shamelessly plug once again our volunteer program. It is amazing volunteers like you who help spread the word about solar and who help protect the rights of solar owners. So please do sign up to receive volunteer notifications in your area. And then lastly, I know that a lot of folks are curious if they're going to be receiving a recording from tonight's webinar, and yes, you are. Within the next 24 to 48 hours, you will receive all the slides and you will receive a recording in your preferred language. So I think after that big spiel, we're kind of just right up on time. So I want to thank you all again for spending your evening here and maybe missing dinner or rushing home to log on. And thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you to Jim for joining us from One Roof. Thank you to Corey and to Emma. And I hope you all have a wonderful Thursday evening.